I go home and I sit in my little office, which is actually our little trailer. It's parked out in the front of the house, and we keep it up, and I sit in there by myself thinking it's going to help, but it doesn't, because I always forget something. My wife and I left home this morning about 6 a.m. in the fog to come here. We got here about 10 to 8, and I was busy looking at all the things, thinking I had everything right, and I missed the prayer. So thank you, David and Moses, for the work that you do there. A comedian once said that the way God punishes us is he gives us children who are just like ourselves. I think there's some truth to that. We have 5 children. And if you're around children very much, or if you have multiple children in your household, there's one thing that you're going to hear for sure, and that's these words: that's not fair. That's not fair. He always goes first, or you love her better than me, or her piece is bigger than mine. You remember that one? Many times. Well, I heard one parent had a solution for that and thought it was a good one, as long as the knife isn't that sharp. If you're cutting a piece of pie or a piece of cake for two or more of your children, you give the knife to the one child to cut the pieces, and the other child gets the first choice to choose. And I'll tell you, when you do that, those pieces are cut as if they're cut with a laser. They're so close and they're so equal. My wife Liz always reminds our kids that fairness doesn't necessarily mean the same. Things may be fair, but it doesn't mean that they're going to look exactly or be exactly the same in every way. But that's one of the oldest contentions, in human history, from the very beginning of Adam and Eve, and then their first 2 kids, Cain and Abel. That's not fair. I'm sure that even Adam and Eve must have heard their children say that, because, of course, sadly, that first complaint about fairness led to the first murder of humanity. It isn't fair. We not only hear our children say that, but adults say it as well. That's why we have so many lawyers and judges in courts, right? And isn't that sadly the reason why some families kind of get split after the reading of a will? Because they say it isn't fair. And at every level of society, someone is complaining that's not fair. So Jesus knew all about our sense of fairness or lack thereof, and so he told this parable. And you know it well, but I just want to kind of remind you about a few details and maybe add a little bit of explanation to it. The parable is about a landowner who went out early around 6 o'clock in the morning to get workers for his vineyard. This was common practice in those days, especially farmers that owned grape vines. They would have to start that grape harvest very early because storms could come up, and once they do, they probably ruin the crop, so it's important to get that harvest done as quickly as possible. And so this farmer goes down to the place where these guys are waiting for work, and at 6 a.m. he goes down there and grabs a bunch of guys and says, "Come on, I'm going to give you a denarius, a silver coin, the standard wage." That was the standard wage in those days. And in those days, the standard length of the day was 12 hours. You worked from 6 until 6. And it was a denarius a day. Now, but here's a detail you may not have known, and that is that a denarius is the average daily wage back in Jesus' day. It was the average daily wage for a worker. But not only was it his or her average daily wage, it was also the average cost of providing food for your family for a day. A denarius. It was so important, especially to the masses of poor families in Israel in those days. A denarius would buy your family what they needed to stay alive, no more or no less. So a day's work for a full day's wage was essential to survival. 1 denarius a day. And during the grape harvest, of course, men who wanted to work, they would go down to the marketplace, which I guess is kind of like going down to the employment center today, looking for a job, and they would wait there. And as you know, this particular landowner kept going back at 9 and noon and 3, and then he went back, I think, around 5 o'clock the last time, and he brought more wages, brought more laborers in, and promised that he would be fair to them with their wage. And normally, they would be paid only a small portion of the denarius. And that would mean, sadly, that their family would only be able to eat so much, but not enough to stave off the hunger pains. So they knew that they were only working for an hour, and so they expected only to receive maybe a 12th of what the rest received. And I hope that you appreciate that what's at stake here for the workers in this story. It's not only about fairness. For some of the workers, maybe for most of them, it was about survival. And they needed that denarius a day to provide for their family. So about 6 o'clock, he starts. During the day, he goes many, many times. He promises the ones that he hires first thing in the morning a denarius. And they were okay with that, because that's what they expected. And when quitting time came, the owner of the vineyard calls his paymaster and says, "Pay the workers their wages, beginning with the last ones who were hired and going to the first." And we know the story, right? We know the story. The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each of them, having worked only an hour, received a full denarius for the day, which meant working only 1 hour, they were able to go and to provide for their family. They were obviously deliriously joyful, and that led to a problem. Because when the paymaster came to the ones who were hired first, they also only received a denarius. And when those who received that denarius, their complaint was, "It isn't fair. We were here all day. We were here in the heat of the afternoon, and yet we get the same as someone who's been here for 1 hour. What's that all about?" And the landowner says, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't we agree to a denarius? So take your pay and go, because if I want to give to the one who is hired for 1 hour the same as I give to you, don't I have the right to do with what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" And then Jesus finishes with these cryptic words. He says, "So the last will be first, and the first will be last." Now, maybe you're wondering why I chose this lesson today for Rachita's affirmation of faith. How does it fit? Well, today is an affirmation of faith. It's actually an affirmation of grace. God's grace. About the generosity of God. God pours out His grace, complete and full, onto anyone who will receive it. And we who have labored in the vineyard, perhaps for most of our lives, would like to think that maybe we'll get a little extra measure of grace from God because we've been at it all our life. But these other people over here, they just kind of came to Christ in the last years of their life. Maybe we'll get a little more grace than what they'll get. But it won't happen. It cannot happen. Now hear this. The Father's love is absolutely without limits. And when He gives grace, He gives the whole thing all at once. Every part of the last bit of it. The Father's love is without limits. It's without reservation. It's without regard to who got to faith first. And if that bothers you, get over it. Because that's the way God's grace is. It's complete and it's full every single time. There's no limits to his grace. It exceeds everything we could ever hope for and everything that we could ever expect. And that's grace. It's poured out, in infinite quantities on you and on me. And it's totally unearned. Totally unearned. And whether we've labored for Christ for 50 years or 5 years, it's exactly the same. The grace they receive and the grace we receive is exactly the same. Doesn't matter if we came to Christ as a child or if we confessed him on our deathbed. That grace is exactly the same. And all we have to do to receive that grace complete and full is to open our hearts to it, whether we're 9 or 90, and it will come. And some might think that's not fair, but hey, that's just the way the Father works. His grace is complete. I guess that's why we call it amazing. Amazing grace. There was a movie some years back. I'm not recommending it. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent, but it was called Saving Private Ryan. I don't know if somebody may remember the title, even if you didn't see the movie. And it was about the Second World War, and it was about the battle at Normandy Beach when the Allied troops assailed the beach, landed on D-Day, and 50,000 Allied troops gave their lives that day for that one particular battle. And the movie opens with an elderly man wandering through a graveyard, present day, which overlooks now Normandy Beach. And he goes to this one tombstone, and he kneels in front of that tombstone, and he begins to weep. Then the movie jumps back about 54 years to that very difficult day of D-Day when the troops, the invasion on Normandy Beach. And as I said, 5,000 Allied troops were killed in that. Wounded and killed on that beach that day in Normandy. And then the plot of the movie begins. It shows the carnage that took place on that beach that day. But then it shows 8 soldiers that are told to go and try and bring Private Ryan back. He was a parachute jumper. He was a soldier that landed behind enemy lines, and he was valuable to the war effort. So 8 soldiers were chosen to go and to bring him back, to bring this paratrooper named Ryan, who had been dropped behind enemy lines. And they go through harrowing experiences for him. And when they find him, several men lose their lives when they try to rescue him. And they do rescue him, but the last one that is killed is the captain of the unit, and he happened to be played by Tom Hanks. And as he dies, he says these 2 words to Private Ryan. He says, "Earn this. Earn this." And then the movie immediately switches back to this man kneeling before this grave, weeping before this grave. And we realize that we're looking at Private Ryan in the present day. And he's before the grave of this captain that told him to earn it. And he looks at his wife, and he slowly stands up and he says, "Tell me that I've been a good person." And what he really meant, his wife was kind of puzzled by what he said, but what he really meant was this. He's asking her, "Tell me that my life has been worth saving. Tell me that my life has been worth saving." Now, isn't that the way we feel about our life and about Christ? Is our life worth his saving? We know that God's grace is free. We know we cannot earn it. We know that we've done nothing to deserve it, but also we know that it cost Christ his life. It cost him his life. And that thought alone should cause us to pause and fall to our knees and to weep and ask ourselves whether our lives lived in response to that act of self-giving love is proving worthy of that act. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, Paul says this. He says, I urge you to live a life that is worthy of the calling that you through love received. I urge you to live a life worthy of your calling. How do we do that? Well, you know what? That's a long verse. And he tells us. He says, be completely humble, he says. Be patient, bearing with one another in love, and make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Now, we know we cannot earn God's grace. It's freely given. But we know that we have opportunity to live a life of service that demonstrates to others and to Him that indeed our life has been changed, ultimately changed because of the sacrifice of Jesus on that cross, because of the grace of God. You know, we're a family here at All Saints. And you know, a family is a family, right? And we have our ups and downs, and we have our closeness, and sometimes our challenges, and so on. But I remember when I was taking pastoral counseling, and I was working with a Mennonite pastor in Hamilton, and he was not just a pastor, but he was a trained family counselor. And so one of the assignments that I had was to counsel this particular individual. And this person was coming to me and complaining about, well, I'm sorry. See, that gives away my bent on this situation. But this person would come and was upset about what was happening at home. And her husband, she had a list of things that were wrong. And you know what? I was very gullible, and I just believed everything I was told. And so when I was talking to my supervisor about it, I was saying, her husband just must be the worst person ever, the most terrible because of this and that and that. And you know what he said to me? He said, Doug, I want you always to remember that most people are doing the best that they can with what they have to work with. And you know, that advice has stuck with me down through the ages. I can be very judgmental in my thinking. I confess that to you. And I can jump to conclusions very quickly. That's something that I do, and the Lord knows about it, and we work on that together. But you know, the one thing that we can do that shows that the grace of God has touched our life is to be that grace to one another. And to always be guided by love for one another. A wife came to her husband one day and she said to him, how much do you love me? He says, I love you so, so much. She said, do you love me enough to die for me? And he said, no. He said, mine is an undying love. Well, Jesus' love was both. It's an undying love and a dying love. He died for us. And you know, in the process of dying for us, His love is undying. It is eternal. It is large. It's huge. That's the grace of God. The absolute grace of God. And you know, life isn't fair. And you know what? Guess what? It's never going to be absolutely fair. It's not going to be absolutely just. But God's grace goes light years beyond anything we can imagine in terms of His forgiveness, His grace, His love, and the way in which He draws us close and reminds us that we belong to him. And all of that comes to you in total fullness just by saying yes to Jesus, which is what Rachita demonstrated today. Just saying yes to Jesus. And that grace is available today, right now. It's available today, and every single day. Truly amazing grace. Amen? Amen. Rachita, would you come forward and pray for